Tonight we are in Acts chapter 23, where we left off last time. Paul had gotten in trouble by saying the word Gentiles to a large group of Jews, and they wanted to rip him apart. Well, the tribune, who is the Roman soldier over the entire Antonia fortress, all somewhere around 1,000 men, hears the commotion that they're going to rip him to pieces and come running to save Paul. Paul speaks, the riot continues, and they usher Paul inside the Antonia fortress to protect him. While he's there, the tribune proceeds to tie him up and is getting ready to beat him into an interrogation. Paul, not wanting to go through such an ordeal, says, "You're not allowed to do this, I'm a Roman." Once they realize that he's a Roman, everybody backs off and cooler heads prevail. The next morning is where we find ourselves. Now, the tribune is wanting information of why the crowds have now twice tried to kill Paul. He doesn't know it, but a third one's coming. So what he does is he decides that he is going to bring in the Sanhedrin. But instead of sending Paul out to the Sanhedrin, because that seems to be a problem every time Paul opens his mouth, that they want to kill him, they decided it's better if they come to us. They will be surrounded by troops. We will be able to squelch any problem that might arise. And so that's what they did. They send for the Sanhedrin, and Paul is about to speak to the Sanhedrin, which will be the fifth and final time the Sanhedrin hears the gospel of Jesus. Up until this point, there has been 5 or 4 that have stood before him. Paul will give the final presentation of the gospel, which they will refuse again. And it will be the death knell, the final nail in the coffin, that will perpetrate the destruction of the temple and all of Jerusalem a mere less than 20 years, less than probably 15 years from this occasion. Now, we're going to come into a man named Ananias. This name is a common name. He is the high priest of the Sanhedrin. He is not to be confused with Annas, the high priest during Jesus' trial. Not the same guy. This is Ananias. This is also, he's not the one that was married to Sapphira, the believers earlier in Acts, Ananias and Sapphira. This is another Ananias altogether. He served between 47 AD and the first Jewish revolt around 67 AD. Surprisingly enough, the Romans didn't kill this guy off in the siege. The Jewish people did that all on their own because he was such a corrupt high priest. He was a really bad guy. He would take the tithes, not of the rich priests, but the common priests. He would go by and steal all of the tithes of the sacrifices and literally leave them hungry. And if you came up against him about it, if you said something about it, his guards would beat you senseless, or they would outright kill you if you didn't allow the robbery. His life was one of great immorality. He used the money that he stole from the priest to support that immoral life, but then also to bribe Roman officials and Jewish officials. He had to stand before Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, because he was encouraging a revolt between the Jews and the Samaritans. And it got so bad, they sent him all the way to Rome. Under bribery and other things that took place during that trial, he was let loose. Only to, a few years later, the people hated him so much that the Jews chased after him. They hired assassins to kill him. And he went and hid in a sewer aqueduct to try and hide from them. Only problem with that, they found him, they drug him out of the muck and the mire, and they stabbed him to death. What a way to go. You will see in a few moments part of the reason that happened. But all of that brings us to Acts chapter 23, verse 1. Paul looked straight at the council, the Sanhedrin council, and he said, "Brothers, with a clear conscience, I have done my duty before God to this very day." Then the high priest Annas ordered the men standing near him to strike him on the mouth. Now, what did Paul say that was so severe and bad? He literally just said, "Brothers, I'm living with a clear conscience." How was that due a strike in the mouth? Well, if you remember when Peter and Stephen went before the Sanhedrin, Peter and Stephen referred to them as leaders or elders or fathers of the nation. They referred to them, they gave an introductory speech showing that the Sanhedrin were high and important and God had placed them there. Paul gives them no quarter because Paul was of the Sanhedrin. When he says brothers, he's saying, hey, I'm on the same level as you all. And needless to say, the high priest didn't take that kindly. And that's the reason he had him struck. What's funny is, verse 3, at this, Paul told him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. How can you sit there and judge me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law order me to be struck? He was very kind in his words. Now, what he was saying, some of you were in my class this morning, we actually talked about it. What Paul is calling the high priest here is he's calling him the greatest of hypocrites. They would whitewash tombs, and Jesus mentioned that, so that people walking by wouldn't touch the grave and accidentally make themselves impure so they couldn't worship at the temple. And so what Paul is saying here is, you look good on the outside, but on the inside, you're a bunch of dead men's bones, you evil thing. How can you be so hypocritical to slap me in the face, or have me slapped in the face, and disobey the law yourself? It was illegal to have a person in court be slapped or hit or punched or abused without a trial. Paul literally has only said one sentence and they already smacked him for it. It's against the law. So Paul's saying, hey, how do you say you're judging me, you hypocrite, when you're not even living by the law yourself? Verse 4, the men standing near him asked, do you mean to insult God's high priest? Paul answered, I didn't realize, brothers, that he is the high priest. After all, it is written, you must not speak evil about a ruler of your people. Paul completely backed up and apologized. That's pretty impressive. Think about it. This guy was a bad guy. He had done some horrible things. He probably didn't deserve the respect as a person, especially to sit in the position of the high priest, right? He probably didn't deserve that. But Paul backed up his words, not because of the person, but because of the position. Paul apologizes, even though he's an evil high priest, he respected the office that the man sat in. It would remind you of King David, or David, before King Saul, that he would not touch the Lord's anointed, even when he probably had the right to do so. He had the right to defend himself. And nobody would have faulted him for getting rid of King Saul early. But David didn't do it because he respected the office. I remember when I first went to Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel's rules were strict. There was a lot of things that I didn't like and I didn't agree with, especially coming from, a different home. And now I'm stuck here and they're telling me when to wake up, when to go to sleep. They're telling me what to eat and what not to, and where I can be and where I can't, and when I got to work and when I can't work, and all of that. I was not happy at all with the rules at Mount Carmel. But after I got saved, the very first book that I read of the Bible and studied for my own personal life was the book of Romans. And in the book of Romans, in chapter 13, Paul says this: "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." I read that looking at the rules at Mount Carmel and said, you know what? If Paul could say that, I can do it. And I can endure through it. Because when Paul wrote Romans chapter 13, the governing authorities over him was Emperor Nero, who was lighting Christians on fire as candlesticks. You don't have to respect the person, but you had better respect the position. And that's exactly what Paul was doing here. By the way, this is another reason why I believe personally that Paul had an eyesight problem. And you remember that whole issue with the thorn in the flesh. I believe it was poor eyesight. It happened because he met Christ on the road to Damascus and became blind. And then after praying, he did receive his sight, but even after praying for it to be completely removed, he wasn't. It was obvious here from his statement that he didn't realize he was speaking to the high priest. Otherwise, he wouldn't have said what he did, because he did respect the position. So it's a distinct possibility. The other thing is, too, this was a hurried call by the tribune, the man over the Antonia fortress. So the Sanhedrin, probably coming to the Antonia fortress itself, didn't have time or weren't going to dress up into their judicial garb. And so the high priest would look like a normal man. If you have bad eyesight and you're at a distance, you probably couldn't tell who's who anyway. So that's just a sidelight. You can take that with what you will. Verse 6. When Paul saw that some of them were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he shouted in the council, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee and a descendant of Pharisees." His dad was a Pharisee. "I'm on trial concerning the hope that the dead will be resurrected." Right? That's his whole problem. They listened to him just fine earlier in the last chapter, talking about Jesus raising him from being raised from the dead and speaking to him. No problem there. The problem was the Gentiles. But Paul, seeing that there was a division in the Sanhedrin, uses it to his advantage. After he said this, an angry quarrel broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Because the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and there is no such thing as an angel or a spirit. But the Pharisees believe in all of those things. So here's what happened. During the time of the Gospels, Matthew through John, the Sanhedrin was ruled by the Pharisees. These were the ones that kept the law down to the T. They made themselves look good by what they did. They looked holier than thou. Jesus accused them of being whitewashed tombs. They were the ones that were in rule. But there was another ruling authority called the Sadducees. The Sadducees, if the Pharisees were the conservatives holding on to the law, the Sadducees were the liberals trying to be progressive to get outside of the law. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in miracles, anything supernatural. Everything was just natural humanity. And what they did was they, instead of trying to rule by religious law, they ruled by political law. And so they maneuvered politically to get the best life that they could here and now because, well, there's nothing hereafter, so you need to make it good now. In between the Gospels and the book of Acts, we've had somewhere around 20 years after the resurrection. You're in the late 50s now AD. The Sadducees have now taken control over the Sanhedrin politically, including that evil high priest Ananias that we just talked about. He also was a Sadducee. And so now Paul, seeing that there is tension between the two groups, he claims one side and says, well, the reason I'm in trouble is because the guys over there don't like my theology. Who's with me? Pretty good wisdom. And now the two groups are fighting amongst themselves, and Paul is left alone. Verse 9. There was a great deal of shouting, until some of the scribes who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and argued forcefully, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" The quarrel became so violent, the tribune was afraid they would tear Paul to pieces. This is the third time he's had this fear. So he ordered the soldiers to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. That poor leader, he has no idea what's going on. Don't know if he speaks Hebrew, but every time this guy Paul opens his mouth, a riot breaks out. And he has no idea why. He's tried to save his life twice, and now for the third time, he's got to pull this guy away, even inside the barracks, from getting ripped to pieces. So verse 11, that night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Have courage, for just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must testify in Rome too." I think it's interesting that Paul has to be encouraged here, and Christ is the one that does it. And we'll talk about it at the end, but this isn't the only occasion that Christ shows up to Paul to encourage him throughout his ministry. At this point, this is probably the lowest of any point that Paul had been in his ministry. He was literally all alone. He was under chains. He was under arrest. No one was with him. Everything he had done up until this point for the people that he loved, the Jews that he said he would rather go to hell than to have them go to hell. Everything he said up until this point has only brought them trying to kill him. He has not been successful at all. And now, for the third time, they've tried to kill him. And Paul's, what am I doing? So Jesus shows up again to comfort him. Notice what he says too. Have courage, for just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome too. In other words, Jesus is saying, hey bud, you did what you were supposed to do. You were successful. Was he? Not in human terms. In human terms, the guy was an absolute failure. He converted no one. All he did was create 3 riots within 5-6 sentences. That's it. But the point was, Paul was being obedient. He said what he was supposed to do. Jesus was by his side through it. And he's going to take him to Rome, and Paul gets to do it again. It's not an issue of the success in human terms. No, it's being obedient. And he was. And Christ was proud of him. Pretty neat. Verse 12. In the morning, the Jewish leaders formed a conspiracy and took an oath not to eat or drink anything before they had killed Paul. More than 40 men formed this conspiracy. You know, I wonder how long they stuck to this promise. I don't know, but I don't think they made it 40 days because that's a really hard thing to do. And, well, we know that Paul didn't die by their hand, so did they starve to death? I doubt it. But look where these guys went with the plot. Did they go to the Roman authorities? No. Did they go to the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Well, kind of. They went to the Sanhedrin. They went to the church, the ruling body of the church for all Israel. They were the ones that brought the plot to kill. You know, after all my years in the church, growing up as a pastor's kid, and now having served 20 years in ministry, it shouldn't, but it does amaze me how many people plot the destruction of others inside the church. And where they get their ammunition and their help are from people inside the church. Happens over and over again. The worst part about it all is, not only do they destroy that person and succeed usually, they succeed in destroying themselves and everybody else around them once they've got their ammunition together. Because it all blows up everywhere. Bible teacher Chuck Missler, in his commentary of this is the way he said it. And I'm just going to quote him. Never underestimate the ability of men to rationalize their actions. It's a very strange it is a very strange thing. I didn't write it down correctly. I apologize, but it's a very strange thing in the church. And the tendency is for religious people to become instruments of evil and ruin the very cause they profess to cherish. It's pretty true. And it's pretty sad. Verse 14. They went to the high priests and the elders, and they said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to taste any food before we have killed Paul." Now here's what we want to do, verse 15. "Now then, you and the council, the Sanhedrin, must notify the tribune to bring Paul down to you on the pretext that you want to look into his case more carefully. But before he arrives, we'll be ready to kill him." But the son of Paul's sister, so Paul's nephew, heard about the ambush. So he came and he got into the barracks and he told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions, this is a guy with 100 people underneath him, pretty highfalutin, and said, "Take this young man to the tribune because he has something to tell him." This is no small coincidence that a boy could be within earshot of the Sanhedrin's plot to kill a man. Think about it. First of all, the boys weren't supposed to be there. How did he get there? And how did he overhear it? Pretty strong coincidence. Further than that, the boy was Paul's own nephew. That's pretty powerful. Further than that, he had access to Paul inside the Antonia fortress. Further than that, Paul had the clout as a Roman citizen to tell that boy and order a centurion to go do his bidding to the tribune who was over the entire Antonia fortress of 1,000 men. This is God lining up Paul's situation because he wasn't done with Paul yet. I believe the rabbis in their writings call coincidence. They say that coincidence is not a kosher word because when you see coincidence, it's God at work, and God is at work here. Verse 18, so the centurion took him. He brought him to the tribune, and he said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to tell you." The tribune, verse 19, took him by the hand, steps aside to be alone with him, and asked, "What have you got to tell me?" Now I want you to picture this in your mind, okay? This guy is the hardest, most powerful Roman soldier in all of Jerusalem. He has 1,000 soldiers under his command. This boy has seen a lot of battle. This guy's a bad dude. This guy is a powerful man. And God puts this one in place so that when a little boy comes up with a message, he is kind enough to take the boy by the hand, take him to somewhere private so the boy can be honest and safe, feeling that he can give the information he needs. Again, this is God's hand all over it. So he takes the boy by the hand, and he takes him off into privacy so that the boy knows that he is safe, that he can give the message that he needs to, that this plot for murder can be, opened up. Verse 20, and he answered, "The Jewish leaders have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to examine his case more carefully. Don't believe them, because more than 40 of them are planning to ambush him. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink before they've killed him. They are already now just waiting for your consent." Verse 22. The tribune dismissed the young man and ordered him not to tell anyone that he had notified him. This powerful Roman soldier Why in the world does he care about a little boy? But he's thinking of the little boy and tells the boy, for his own protection, hey, when you leave, don't tell anybody you told me this. Because his life would be at risk, right? And yet he's looking out for this little boy. God placed that man right there for that reason in that day. This is God at work. Verse 23. Then he summoned 2 centurions and ordered to get 200 soldiers ready to leave for Caesarea at 9 o'clock tonight. They're going to do this by evening time. I mean, they're moving on this task. Along with 70 mounted soldiers and 200 soldiers with spears or javelin men who would throw javelins. Provide a mount for Paul to ride and take him safely to Governor Felix. Now, again, this tribune is over the Antonia fortress with around 1,000 men. He gives the orders for 470 men to protect this one guy going to Caesarea Maritime. He literally empties half of his coffers of soldiers to protect this guy. One man. Now, I'd say he's going to be safe going up. But this also tells you the political scene that was going on in Jerusalem at the time. We're talking about one man, and this tribune is so nervous about a revolt after 3 times trying to kill him, a whole group. He's willing to send half of his forces to protect that guy, and he has no idea why that guy's in that much trouble. Within less than 15 years, this very man, this tribune, is going to be walking over rubble of places that he has destroyed himself because the people will revolt against him. This is how bad the situation is right now, and God is exiting Paul out of that situation. Here's another cool thing. Notice what he says there in verse 24. Get the boy a horse. This guy is a prisoner. You're going to send 470 troops, half your troops, to follow this guy, and then you're going to give him a horse to ride? You're not even going to make him walk? Can you imagine what the 400 foot soldiers around him are thinking? What's up with this guy? Who is this joker? And he gets to ride a horse and not me? God works it out that even Paul gets to ride on a horse all the way up to Caesarea. It's pretty powerful. Verse 25. So he wrote a letter with this message to take with Paul. From Claudius Lysias to Governor Felix. Greetings, Your Excellency. This man has been seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I went with a guard and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. It's very interesting. He conveniently forgot to mention that he has wrongfully held this man, strapped him in arms, and was about to physically interrogate him. That doesn't need to be brought up, you know. He just conveniently forgot about that one. Verse 28, I wanted to know the exact charge they were making against him, so I had him brought before their council. I found that although he was charged with questions about their law, there was no charge against him deserving death or imprisonment. Since the plot against the man has been reported to me, I'm sending him to you at once. In other words, I'm giving you the ball, buddy. This is all yours. I've also ordered his accusers to present their charges against him before you. Now, the man that he's writing to is Antonius Felix. This was Pilate's successor, the same Pilate that washed his hands of Jesus in Jesus' trial. He is now the governor of Judea during this time. His background was he was a slave, but he was freed by Claudius's mother. Claudius was the emperor, and he was freed by her. Tacitus, who is an ancient historian, wrote this about Felix. He said, he exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. That wasn't a compliment. He was called to be a vulgar ruffian. During his rule, the countryside became a place of anarchy, where guerrilla bands would literally just do what they wanted to do. Absolutely everybody hated this man named Felix. Because although he was governor, he was still really a slave on the inside. He was a terribly immoral man, very lustful, they said in the history. He married a lady named Drusilla. He married into the Herod family. Anybody that was dumb enough to marry into the Herod family, I should say something. His wife was the daughter of Herod Agrippa the First. You know, the one that died with the worms, the nasty way? Yeah, because God struck him. Her brother was Herod Agrippa the Second. Just so she could marry this guy Felix, she left her first husband so she could be with him. Turns out by then she was his third wife. This guy was rough. And this is who Paul is going to be standing before in his trial. Verse 31. So the soldiers, in keeping with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now this is a fortress halfway between Jerusalem and Caesarea Maritime. It was a little outcropping on top of a hill that had a fortress. It was very easy to get to, but also easily defended. The next day, they let the horsemen ride with Paul while they returned to their barracks. When these men came to Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. After reading the letter, the governor asked which province Paul was from. On learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers arrive." Then he ordered Paul to be kept in his custody in Herod's palace. Can't be too bad. You get to be stuck in Herod's palace, and I'll show you some pictures next week of the beautiful place that Herod had there. He's not in chains and irons because he hasn't been on trial yet. What we don't see in our English translation in modern times, when Felix asks him what province he's from, Paul saying he's from Cilicia of Tarsus was huge. You had two different sets of provinces. Cilicia was an imperial province, which meant it was under the direct rule of the emperor himself. So what this is God moving the pieces again on his chessboard so that Paul can go to Rome. Because when you get beyond Governor Felix, the only place up is Emperor Nero himself. And so this is God working on underneath the scenes, behind the scenes, so that Paul can testify in Rome. I wanted to go back to that. I mentioned it earlier. Multiple times, Jesus showed himself to Paul in visions to encourage him while he was in his ministry. A few years after Paul's conversion, his life was in danger in Jerusalem, and Jesus appeared to him in the temple, told him what to do. That was Acts 22, last chapter. When Paul was discouraged in Corinth and contemplated going elsewhere, Jesus appeared to him and encouraged him to stay. That was in Acts 18. Here, where he's at an all-time low, completely alone in his ministry, now under guard, in Acts 23, Jesus appeared to him again and encouraged him that he will go on to Rome. Paul, in a few chapters, will receive another encouragement from the Lord while he's in the midst of the storm, and that their boat won't capsize and they won't die in the way. That's Acts 27. Then also, when he wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, he mentions that during his trial in Rome, the Lord also visited him and encouraged him. I have no real idea why, but I have not been able to escape this verse as of late, or these few verses. Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, as Jesus is getting ready to go, like I've mentioned in a couple different Bible studies and sermons, Jesus said this, "Therefore, as you go, disciple people in all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you each and every day until the end of the age." Every time I've come across, the Holy Spirit's brought this verse to my mind over the last few weeks, and I don't really know why. Every time he has, something else has popped out to me. And this time, as I was thinking about it in reference to Jesus showing up to encourage Paul, those two words, and remember. When you're in the midst of the struggle and when you're in the midst of the trial, remember, I am with you each and every day. And I will do that until the end of the age. Psalm 139 says this, Lord, you've examined me and you know me. You know when I rest and when I'm active. You understand what I'm thinking and when I'm distant from you. You scrutinize my life and my rest. You are familiar with all my ways. Even before I have formed a word with my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. He knows just about everything about me. He knows my situation. He knows who I am. And then verse 5. You encircle me from back to front, placing your hand upon me. Do you get the picture? I don't even know how I could possibly show you a picture. But Jesus is in front of me. He's behind me. He's to my left and he's to my right. And if that wasn't good enough, he's got his hand right over top of my head. So it doesn't matter the circumstance that I'm in. It doesn't matter the struggle I'm in. It doesn't matter the situation and how hard it is, how alone I feel, how distracted I am, whatever. He's got me in this little bubble. And he knows me perfectly. And he promises me that he's never going to leave me. He's never going to forsake me. I know the days ahead for all of us are uncertain and they're difficult. We don't know what they involve. But I place myself under his hands because he knows me. He knows my heart. He knows my work. He knows my paths ahead. So I surrender myself to his will and I place myself under his tender care. David Livingstone is one of my spiritual heroes. He was a missionary to Africa. He suffered a lot to be a missionary in Africa. We hear about him in our history books as this great explorer who explored all over Africa. What our history books don't tell us, trying to hide it, is the reason he was doing that was because he was trying to evangelize every last African for Jesus. And he went from town to village to hovel to preach the gospel. He lost his family and he even lost his wife in the process, spending most of his time alone with just those that went with him to minister into Africa. After burying his wife, he's standing there next to the hole in the ground, and somebody recorded his prayer. And he said, "Send me anywhere, only go with me. Lay any burden on me, only sustain me. And sever any ties, but the tie that binds me to your service and to your heart." He had nothing left. Literally everything in his life was gone except his Jesus. And so as he's burying his last vestige of life and family, he says, "Lord, you can tear anything out of me. You can tear anything away from me, but not you. Go with me, put me under anything, as long as you hold me up to bear it." My favorite part about that story is he went on to minister the rest of his life. And finally, he had these two men that helped him along. He was very weak. And they asked him, "Hey, are you going to go to this village and preach?" And he said, "No, I think I want to stay home and I want to pray today." And so they said, "That's fine." And they waited outside his home. And he didn't come out. He didn't come out. And finally, after several hours, they were getting worried about him. And they found him on his knees, deceased. I love the picture. He asked that the Lord would not remove himself from him. And the Lord stayed with David Livingstone all through his life. And then at the very end of his life, he's praying to his Savior. And his Savior comes by the hand in the middle of the prayer and takes him to eternity. Each and every day, he promises that he's never going to leave us outside in the storm. He promises that he will be with us To be honest, part of the reason I'm thinking about this is I'm thinking about Jim with his surgery tomorrow. Jerry's back in the hospital, and Melanie with her cancer. And several others that are going through some very difficult times right now that I can't mention. But through each and every difficult situation of life, He has never left any of us, and He never will. With each of us, He is with us each and every day. We need to hold on to the promise, and I encourage you to hold on to it yourselves. What He said in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, I will never leave you, nor forsake you. I don't know what you're going through. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe that conclusion was all just for me. But I want you to know, to hold on tight, because He promises that every place you go, even in the worst and the darkest of times, He is not going to leave your side. He's never forsaken anybody else, and He's not going to do that for you either. Let's pray. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.